Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary. Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland
Members, having been given notice by not less than 30 members, I have summoned the Assembly to meet today for the purpose of debating a motion on the impact of COVID-19 on school opening. Clerk, please read the motion.
That this Assembly notes with concern reports that the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies may have recommended school closures, is deeply concerned by the number of deaths from COVID-19, recognises the concerns of teachers, pupils and parents, calls for urgent clarity from the Minister of Education on what work has been undertaken with the Department of Health on protecting school children, teachers, parents and the wider public from the spread of COVID-19, and further calls on the Minister of Education to outline the medical and scientific advice his department has received and to explain whether he will consider additional mitigations, including a phased return or extended school closure if this has been recommended by the medical and scientific advice.
Thank you, and I call Daniel McCrossan to move the motion.
I beg to move.
Thank you. And the Business Committee has agreed to allow up to 2 hours for this debate. You will have 10 minutes to propose a motion and 10 minutes to wind. All other speakers have 5 minutes. One amendment has been selected and printed on the marshal list. As this amendment has been tabled by the proposers of the motion, I will ask you now to move the amendment and then address both the amendment on the motion when opening the debate.
I beg to move.
Thank you. And please now open the debate on the motion and the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the members of this House that joined the SDLP in signing a recall petition that forced the meeting of this Assembly. I do recognise it is New Year's Eve, and there is many other places that many of us would rather be than in this chamber debating on an issue that we have warned about for many, many weeks, if not months. This is not a new pandemic. We are nearly a year into this crisis situation, this public health crisis, and yet we are seeing a Minister for Education spiralling dangerously in one position without taking heed of the warnings from school leaders, from unions, from politicians, from the public, from parents, from children, and yet he has continued up until this morning, 7:30 this morning, when a statement was released, to persevere with the 4th of January as the opening date for schools. This was always a dangerous position, Mr. Speaker, and one that many people had profound concerns about. The situation with coronavirus has got very, very serious. Our communities are rife with infection. Every single one, every part of our community is concerned about how dangerously this is spiralling out of control. How this Minister, Mr. Speaker, felt that it was appropriate to return schools on the 4th of January at any stage, given that we knew that the infection rates would spiral out of control over Christmas. How he suggested and stood over the 4th of January is the reason that we were in this situation today. Our hands were tied. We were forced to this position. And just at the outset, I'd like to say, Mr. Speaker, we are in this position because of a minister that is continuing to ignore everybody. We don't know who is advising this minister. We don't know what scientific or medical advice this minister is following. But I'm pretty certain that all along we have been told that the incubation period for this virus has been up to 2 weeks. But yet this minister wanted to return children into a classroom, 30 at least into a classroom in front of a teacher, which puts people at huge risk. You'll have your chance, Minister, in a minute. I'll make my point. Thank you. This minister has forced us into a position where this Assembly has been recalled on New Year's Eve. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, that we are in this situation. Teachers, principals, school staff, parents, members of the community have all spoken out in outrage and with considerable anxiety. But yet, it has taken, once again, a recall petition for this minister to change his mind. It has taken Gavin Williamson to determine the English position, for this minister to determine the Northern Irish position. A totally reckless situation, and shows a minister, Mr. Speaker, that is not in control of his own department or brief, and it shows, Mr. Speaker, a minister that is more willing to follow a Conservative government instead of actually putting the interests of our community first. I'll give way.
Thank the member for giving way, although I do have to say the prospect of any decisions getting taken on the basis of what the member is saying rather than the scientific advice that I've got is one that I think sort of beggars some level of belief. But I'm just wondering, in terms of the issue of the return on the 4th of January, because there's also been, in the last 24 hours, a shift from down south, given the fact that, I think until yesterday, the same position in terms of dates was taken by the Republic of Ireland, I'm wondering, did he give the same advice or the same admonishment to his affected party colleagues in Fianna Fáil who were pursuing the same position?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for the intervention. Minister, this is not a day to be playing with the table tennis ball. Lives are at risk. Lives are at risk, Minister, and let me make a point. You cannot dare to compare, Mr. Speaker, with the leadership shown by Minister Nora Foley in the south of this island. She, from the outset... No, I'm not, Minister...
Point of order. I'm just wondering if there is reference being made to the Minister down south. It may be helpful if the member actually got her name right. It's Norma rather than Nora.
Minister, if you want to play about with this, people are watching today and they're very concerned about their children and their teachers. So, if you pay more attention to what they're saying, Mr. Speaker, instead of throwing balls across the room, then maybe we'd get somewhere. Minister, Mr. Speaker, the situation is very, very dangerous. It's very, very serious. And this minister, Mr. Speaker, cannot compare to the south. Why? Because the minister down there has shown great, profound leadership. She has put mitigations, protections and resources in place to protect children, protect teachers, protect classroom assistants and in turn protect their parents and families as well. But this minister is willing, Mr Speaker, to die in the ditch for the transfer test, a glorious DUP agenda that they were willing to sacrifice our granny and grandas for during this Christmas period when COVID has been rife. But yet, Mr Speaker, we look to the south for leadership. Do you know why, Mr Speaker? Because that minister stepped up and listened to the school leaders within her community. That minister also used extra public buildings to ensure that social distancing could be used, could be enforced. That minister also made face masks mandatory. That minister employed more teachers. That minister also, Mr Speaker, made sure that the classroom environment was safe. This minister has done absolutely nothing. And if he wants to go around the houses, Scotland has, Mr Speaker, put protections in place to protect teachers and staff and children. Wales has done the same. Even England. England, the minister, Gavin Williamson, who our minister looks up to so proudly, has put mitigations and protections in place. We are in this situation today, Mr Speaker, quite simply because this minister has failed to act. We are in a situation, Mr Speaker, because this minister has ignored warnings for months. This minister doesn't seem to believe that this virus can be carried by children home to families. This minister doesn't believe that teachers, Mr Speaker, are terrified. But we're put in a situation where we're now deciding between the protection of a child's education and their lives. And that is a deplorable situation that we've been forged into by a minister's inaction in this Assembly. I don't think it's enough. And to be very clear, Mr Speaker, we do not want schools to close. No member of this House could safely say they want schools to close. But what we do want, Mr Speaker, is schools to reopen safely, with mitigations and protections and resources in place, which this minister has failed to do. And yes, I've heard him over the last few days make comments about special educational needs children and vulnerable children, and I share his concerns, and I'm glad that he is sharing the concerns of the many people that have expressed them with him, particularly the Education Committee. And I also share the position the special educational needs settings need to remain open. But he also, Mr Speaker, needs to put in place protections for the teachers that are going to be in those rooms, the classroom assistants and others who are going to be directly exposed to this virus. The situation is grave. We're back here today, Mr Speaker, because this minister waited until 7:30 this morning to release a statement that practically repeated what the English minister, Gavin Williamson, put out yesterday. Why can't this minister stand on his own 2 feet and actually listen to the teachers, the principals, the young people in our society and recognise that COVID is spiralling out of control? And the new variant, even over the last week, there's been hundreds of people under the age of 20 that have tested positive for this virus. It is spreading throughout our community without control. And despite the record high rates of infection within communities across Northern Ireland, in addition to multiple schools and unions raising considerable concern, the minister has failed to act. In the minister's statement on the 21st of December, Mr Speaker, to the ad hoc committee, he acknowledged that options needed to be developed that both protected the education and safety of our children while also combating the virus. Sounds lovely, but there was nothing behind it. There has not been any communication with schools, teachers, principals whatsoever. And they've been left again to the last minute by this last-minute minister, Mr Speaker, who flips around at the last minute, leaving teachers now 2 days, in some instances, due to his statement this morning, to prepare to open parts of their school for nursery places or special educational needs schools. 2 days. It's totally outrageous, and it is a failure of this minister to put the interests of our children first. This House is largely united. I would even argue, Mr Speaker, the people in the minister's own party disagree with his position and his dithering on these very important issues. But again, I will continue to repeat, this is not, for the public out there, this is not about closing schools. But anyone that thinks schools were safe to open on the 4th of January, which this minister was planning on doing, Mr Speaker, until 7:30 this morning, is a serious failure on his part. And a serious failure on all of us if we weren't to hold him to account in this chamber today. Can I also touch on the situation around resourcing? If this minister is serious about protecting children's education, this minister would have acted sooner. And clearly this minister has continued blindly to ignore concerns of teachers and young people. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll finish on this. This minister needs to get serious, because I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, public confidence is at an all-time low. And if he doesn't step up very soon, I'll find myself on the same side of it.
Okay, thank you. And I call Robin Newton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think today really is, and we all recognise the very serious health situation that there is out there. And in recognising that serious health situation, I want, first of all, to pay tribute to the principals, the teachers, the support staff in schools, and indeed the Board of Governors in all of the schools, whose only main interest is the protection of the children and their education. We should also recognise in these difficult days the very serious work that is being done by the National Health Service, and particularly those doctors and nurses who are working at the very sharp end of things. I also want to say thank you to every nurse, every doctor who is in that frontline service. I want to thank the Minister for his attendance today, and indeed for his previous attendance in the Chamber and his willingness to attend the committees on a regular basis, and indeed to give generously of his time when he has attended the committees, often extending the amount of time which allows the committee members to pose questions and seek advice, seek answers from the Minister. And I do think within that context, Mr. Speaker, it is disappointing that in a press statement to the Belfast Telegraph, the proposer of the motion referred to the Minister as ducking and diving. Peter Weir has never ducked and never dived. He has given generously of his time in this situation. Appalling language, as my colleague says. I welcome the work of the Minister, initially in his work with the Department of Education, along with the Minister for Health, Department of Health, the Education Authority, and indeed the Public Health Agency, as he sought professional advice on handling the situation in our schools, with a name of only trying to keep our pupils safe. And I do think the proposer of the motion referred to the Minister only seeking advice from a Conservative government, but yet the motion calls on the Minister to seek advice from the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. I think that's a government organisation. I think, Mr. Speaker, SAGE has offered advice, and if I am not wrong in this, I would believe that the Minister, in seeking his advice at this moment in time, and he has indicated in his most recent statement that he is seeking advice from the Special Advisory Group, seeking advice from seeking advice from what's his right title? Sorry, I don't want to belittle the man by... seeking advice from Dr. McBride and Professor Ian Young. In seeking that advice, and my belief is that Dr. McBride and Professor Young also engage with SAGE as they go about their work. On the 21st of December, and the proposer of the motion has referred to it, on the 21st of December, the Minister indicated that he would, the Executive agreed to a full return to school with mitigations as soon as it was safe to do so. The Executive obviously has within that the First and Deputy First Minister, Minister Murphy, Minister Mallon, Minister Long and Minister Swann. So the Executive agreed on the safe return to schools. I'll give way.
Please enlighten us as to what the mitigations are that this Minister has put in place, because no one can seem to find the detail.
Member has an
I think if
additional
you
minute.
look at the end of the Minister's statement, you'll see the indication of the direction that the Minister was going, and indeed the statement that you referred to this morning, the further directions that the Minister is taking. But indeed that the Minister indicated that the Executive, when considering the range of very severe but necessary restrictions in the current circumstances, did not seek to close schools. So the Minister, in his plans at that time, had the support of his Executive colleagues in his directions. Now the situation is changing, and the situation is changing extremely quickly. We know that. We've seen the actions that have been taken, England, Scotland, Wales and the Republic. And I commend the Minister for his response to the situation as it stands at this moment in time. Mr. Speaker, I suppose it is not, this motion is not unexpected. Not unexpected. It is a very serious situation that we're playing with. And I know that the Minister recognises the seriousness of the situation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, thank you. And I call Nicola Brogan.
Sinn Féin are conscious of the impact that the initial wave of school closures had on the lives of our children and young people. This decision at the time was not taken lightly and was taken in the interest of protecting public health and saving lives. We have been clear since the school restart in late August that the school setting is the best place for our children and young people to have their social, developmental and educational needs met. We are also aware that for many, school is often a sanctuary, a place of safety and refuge for some of our most vulnerable children. Sinn Féin wants schools to be open, but it has to be demonstrably safe and sustainable and in line with the scientific and public health advice. Over the last number of months, Sinn Féin have been vocal in calling for scenario planning and for contingency planning to take place across all areas of education, from examinations to blended learning, but at every turn the Minister dithered. We welcome the announcement from the Minister this morning, but unfortunately many questions remain unanswered and school communities and families still await clarity. The Minister's proposals on remote learning will further disadvantage and exacerbate an already uneven playing field. Our GCSE students and their families are crying out for clarity in relation to modules they are due to sit. What measures are being put in place to ensure that these pupils are supported to take these exams at this difficult time? And what happens in the event that a child is forced to self-isolate when they should be sitting an exam? The fact is that a distinct lack of contingency planning and preparedness has been a hallmark of Minister Weir's time in office throughout the course of this pandemic. Even when asked about what work he was doing in relation to the possibility for future school closures, the Minister remarked that he wasn't preparing for failure. I would argue that failing to prepare was preparing for failure. Teachers, principals and other essential school staff work tirelessly to maintain a safe school environment, taking on new roles as track and tracers in the absence of necessary support from the PHA. The pressure on our school communities has been immense. Schools have not had the luxury of decisive and strategic leadership from their Education Minister. The Health Minister, Robbie Swann, in this chamber said, and I quote, "I do not believe that the return to school as normal in January is a sustainable position." The Education Minister's initial plan tinkered around the edges and lacked urgency and decisiveness. We need to see the advice and the recommendations from the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer in the Department of Health, and we need to see exactly what mitigations are required if our schools are to remain safe spaces for our children and our education workforce in the time ahead. The new strain and its increased transmissibility is of huge concern to school staff and families alike, and they need reassurance and support. But most of all, they need to see clear action from the Education Minister. It is imperative that we do not see a rollback on statutory obligations in relation to the provision for our children and young people with special educational needs. We must be cognizant of the role of special schools and the support and provision that they provide to children, young people and their families. The Minister and his department must not allow these families to be left behind again in the event of these new period of closures. In addition, the Minister must also ensure measures are in place to protect and support the education and the well-being of those children who are designated as vulnerable. There are no easy solutions to the problems we face in relation to education provision in the current COVID-19 pandemic. But above all, we must endeavour to ensure the safety of our school communities and the continuity of learning for our children and our young people. Thank
you. And I call Robbie Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to be on the record. I'm sure you'll join me in wishing all of those involved in the educational sector a happy new year. 2020 was a remarkable year which will go down in all of our histories and our memories as one which was incredibly tough, regardless of where you sat, what you worked at and what you did, and it will have a lasting impact on all of us, and no less so on the mental health that we all have, or to greater and lesser degrees, and in the educational sector, whether that is our students, our pupils, our teachers, principals, the drivers of the buses, those that work creating meals and stuff for our pupils. It has had that impact, and that's why a good planning is necessary. It is good to be here today. Sadly, it could have been avoided. I do believe it could have been avoided had we have had this news sooner. And nonetheless, the news is welcome. The steps that the Minister is proposing are welcome, Minister, and some of those will have been proposed to you previously. But what we have to understand is we're not working in normal circumstances. We talk about risk assessment, and the times that we're actually in, guys, are dynamic risk assessment, which is totally different than risk assessment, and we have to make these decisions as best as we can, as has been said by the member across the chamber, with the medical and scientific advice to hand, and that does change rapidly, and I do believe that, Minister, you were in communications with the Health Minister on that recently, and we have to learn from these instances where we can give people that information quicker, because public confidence is ebbing, and we are all responsible. It's not just the ministers of this House, but we're all responsible for managing that, and we all need to be cognizant too. I'm going to say this in the spirit of the time of the year we're in. We should be cognizant of the mental health of every minister that's in this House. I'll bring everybody's remembrance back to just January of last year when we come back. Each of the parties, the bigger parties, had a choice in their departments to choose. The DUP picked economy and education, because that's what they thought was their priority. Sinn Féin picked finance and communities. The SDLP picked infrastructure, and the Ulster Unionist Party picked health. And I'm not going to condone anybody for picking what they picked. But, guys, that was their priorities, and that was the priority for the DUP. I do believe the Minister may have got some things wrong in his tenure, but I'm sure each Minister will have got things wrong along the way. What we need to do is ensure that we learn from them. I would like to hear a commitment from the Minister at the end of this, that he has listened and he has looked at our motion, which I signed, which I welcomed and signed, because I thought that we needed to give that leverage to see that change come. To err is human, to forgive is divine, and I hope the Minister can just take that in the manner that it's meant. Absolutely.
I take the member's point, but will the member agree with me? How many times are we going to call this Minister to this House? What's it going to take for him to actually listen and learn his lessons?
I thank the member for his intervention.
The member has a minute.
Yeah, thank you. And the Minister perhaps can respond to that, and I hope he does in a positive manner. There are still issues that we need to address, and I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm just going to ask the Minister to address them, perhaps, and I've been inundated, as many of the members will have, because with the guidance that's been given today, there are still some uncertainties, if you like. I do welcome the move for special schools. The committee has met regularly, and we have a real passion to see that sector supported. So with regard to special schools, Minister, what further mitigations can be put in place, for, especially in and around transport? And special schools, as most of us will know, is a challenging but very worthwhile environment to work in. But the 2 metre distancing is even more hard to maintain in those instances, and COVID is a live threat. So we need to make sure that we protect those that work in those environments. The other thing then, obviously, is with regard to mainstream schools, Minister, just clarification again for those children that have been statemented and those children who are vulnerable. I believe, and it's my understanding, that they will have places in mainstream schools, just if we could get the confirmation that through mainstream, that those children with statements, as well as vulnerable children who are picked up through the description of a vulnerable child. Perhaps you'd like to clear that up in your winding, or if you're more than welcome to explain it. Yeah.
Vulnerable children, largely speaking, while there's a separate category of those within special schools that are not counted as part of the vulnerable children definition, broadly speaking, those that with statements are then counted within the definition on the vulnerable side of it. I think that the accurate definition of vulnerable children that we found actually that there were relatively small numbers came in during the previous, covers around about 30,000 children.
Thank you, Minister. And one of the issues that I have, and I'll just spend my last sort of minute and a half on this, is the issue of blended and remote learning. And I think I've had a real concern about it from the start, because our teachers haven't been instructed to use remote learning and blended learning. They do their very best, and there's some fantastic examples of how that is. But we do have digital poverty across Northern Ireland. There was a mother in touch with me yesterday, and she has 5 children of school age. She doesn't have 5 computers. She doesn't have 5 phones. She has limited broadband. And we are agreed that face-to-face teaching is best. With that regard, Minister, has there been an assessment done on the impact of remote and blended learning? What I would like to see is that the examination bodies do not test any of our pupils on anything that's been learnt at home, that everything that is tested is based on face-to-face teaching, because I don't think there's anybody in this House, and the proposer of the motion indeed covered this too, that all of us do desire to see our children in school, but we desire to see them in school safely. And on that, Minister, when their schools do return in greater number post the 11th of January, can you give us confidence today that absolutely every mitigation that is possible can be put in place to keep our teachers safe and give our pupils and parents the confidence with early indications of what that might be? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And I call Chris Lyttle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Deja vu, Mr. Speaker. The Education Minister, who doesn't want to meet with the Education Committee, doesn't want to engage with this Assembly, and doesn't, it seems, want to make decisions until Gavin Williamson has made his, has been required to do so by a cross-party, cross-designation Assembly recall again today for the second time in less than 2 weeks. It is very difficult for me to speak on behalf of the Education Committee today, given the Education Minister's statement on this important matter of school restart was made via broadcast and social media at approximately 0700 hours on the 31st of December, with no prior engagement with the Education Committee. I am able to say that Education Committee members have expressed serious concern for the Minister's approach to school restart for weeks and called for a phased school restart in this Assembly on the 21st of December. We do now have a statement with which to engage, so speaking as Alliance Education spokesperson, I will say this, Mr. Speaker. Pausing school-based learning is, of course, a measure of last resort and reflects the seriousness of the situation that we are in. We must, as a community, adhere to the regulations to drive down the transmission of this virus to help our children to attend school. But, Mr. Speaker, the Education Minister's stubborn refusal to engage the advice of school leaders and indeed scientific and medical experts in a timely manner is leading to decisions and announcements of this nature that make contingency planning for teachers and parents distressingly difficult. These decisions should have been taken before the end of term, and otherwise they have left our dedicated teaching and non-teaching staff with only 1 day to prepare for remote and key worker provision from next week. The Minister has to accept that this approach has to change direction. Mr. Speaker, the statement has left many more questions than it has given answers. And I would ask the Minister to be willing to attend an emergency meeting of the Assembly Education Committee in order to deal with those in more detail. But I'll endeavour to ask some today, Mr. Speaker. Give way briefly, yes.
I'm just wondering, would the member agree with me that it doesn't help parents and it doesn't help children when the Minister is so categorical and definitive in his statements that schools will open in the first week in January, instead of saying we'll assess the situation and we'll take the medical and scientific advice and act on that?
Member has an additional minute.
Thank the member for his intervention. And yes, I think that is at the heart of what this Assembly is saying. Engage with parents, engage with school leaders, engage with members of this Assembly to heed what those concerns are, rather than continuing to adopt this stubborn, dogmatic approach on these extremely dynamic issues. Mr Speaker, I would ask the Education Minister if he could outline the scientific and medical basis for his decisions announced today. For example, why 4 weeks remote learning for Year 8 to Year 10s and none for special schools, preschool and childcare, and why 1 week for exam years, indeed with the option, it seems, of no weeks for exam years being given to schools as well. Why 1 day to prepare for these new arrangements? Will there be, as a previous member has alluded to, their option for some degree of weekly review, given the seriousness of the situation we find ourselves in? Will there be extra measures to protect children and adults in special schools? Will there be priority vaccination for teaching, non-teaching staff in schools, particularly in special schools? Has the Education Minister established the Vulnerable Children Reference Group as recommended by the Education Committee? Will clinically vulnerable children and adults be attending school, or is there shielding advice for such categories? Why is Year 11 not considered an exam year? What has the Department of Education done to ensure every child experiences equal educational opportunity via remote or school-based learning under these arrangements? What enhanced testing and tracing is going to be in place? And how, Mr Speaker, can the Education Minister effectively suspend school-based operations until January the 11th for so many of our children, and yet support the sitting of transfer tests on the 9th of January? How can those tests fairly and safely and legally proceed? It is a legitimate question. It is focused on this year alone, and I don't think parents have received a satisfactory answer to that question, or the question of what the contingency plan is for any child who is unable to sit tests due to a COVID-related absence, or indeed to further clarification with regards to clinical vulnerability. Mr Speaker, the Minister also said that he would extend the use of face coverings, compliance on face coverings and school buses, messaging to improve responsible behaviour of young people. Has he delivered on those, as he said he would do swiftly? There are many, many issues to address here, Mr Speaker. I hope the Education Minister can do that today.
Thank you, and I call Maurice Bradley.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for attending here today, as he has done on many occasions. And there's calls here for a change of attitude, and I think we all need to examine our attitudes in this place. There are more than the ministers in this place need to change their attitudes. Mr Speaker, many teachers have been in contact with me to urge keeping children at school. Many have expressed the opposite viewpoint. Opinion amongst parents is also divided. For some parents, children not being at school will have a detrimental impact on their income. Many parents work in essential services, fitting their part-time working arrangements around school time. Therefore, no matter what the Minister would have announced here today, he was not going to please one opinion or the other. There is no one-size-fits-all. Mr Speaker, I ask for consideration of the needs of vulnerable children. Children who have educational statements, can we afford to interrupt their schedules again? Children suffering from autism, ADHD or other complex needs. School is a necessary routine for these children and young people, and often school is the only respite some parents may have. These children and young people's needs must be given careful consideration. There are other issues that would be a priority. Top is education, but also preparing children for the next stage of their development, whether it is for examinations, transfer from primary to post-primary, further education, or as young people going out into employment. Vital learning, development time and experience has already been lost. Going home from here last night, I drove past the local football field. There was a group of children playing in the Mugga under floodlights, about 9 or 10, and I thought, what's the impact of all this COVID-19 having on the mentality of our young people, on their mental health and their physical well-being? We have to take that into consideration too. I would say there was about 9 or 10 of them, but I would ask that consideration be taken into consideration as well. Schools take thousands of children under their care and nurturing every day. For some, it is an escape, perhaps from abuse at home, perhaps an opportunity to have at least one full meal in a day. No one size fits all. No matter what the Minister does, he will please some and disappoint others. I will.
I thank the member for giving way. Will the member agree with me that we're in this dangerous position because the Minister has not put in place the necessary mitigations, protections and resources to ensure that schools can continue?
Member has an additional minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the member for that intervention. And I think, being on the Education Committee, he should be fully aware of all the commitments the Minister has already given, both financially and otherwise. Has anyone assessed the role of CAMS lately? I would imagine their workload has increased dramatically during this pandemic. Have they the staff and the resources to cope? Mr. Speaker, I provide no answers, only questions, and I do not for one minute underestimate the task, the thankless task, the Minister has in trying to navigate through the many complex issues this pandemic has caused to the education of our children, young people and adults. None of it, Mr. Speaker, is of the Minister's making. We are all in this together. We are all trying to make decisions that benefit those who send us here to represent them. My appeal is we do what is best for all our children, and in doing so make every effort to consider the impact our decisions will have, especially on vulnerable children, children who have educational statements, and that we endeavour to give them clarity and support, and also support for their parents and teachers, including transport. Mr. Speaker, there is no normal in these abnormal times, and as we peer through the mists of uncertainty, there is no abnormal answer to make normal again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And I call Colm Gildernew.
I would like today to, I suppose, welcome the decision that the Minister has made, although it is very, very late in the day, and surely the same information was available 10 days ago, which would have allowed schools to plan better. However, we are operating in a context overall of significant and growing health concerns, and in that context,
I appreciate we're in a very moving situation, and indeed the need for additional measures, I think, largely arising out of the situation that's arisen post-Christmas. From the chronology of events, I was going to deal with this later on, we were contacted on Tuesday evening by the Minister for Health, CMO and CSA, saying that there needed to be a change compared to where we were, and we've worked with them since then. So it's difficult, if you like, to retrofit something prior to that when there's been a request for further change at that particular point.
Member has an additional minute.
And thank you to the Minister for that intervention. And I suppose that does you know, we are dealing with a situation here where yesterday we have had, in the past 24 hours, 2,143 cases. That's 40% of all tests that are coming back as positive. We're looking at two very significant mutations, the one that emerged in the south of England. There's also one in South Africa, both of which potentially have considerable impact on younger people in terms of transmissibility and potentially on the effect and impact on them. These are very worrying. And while we all value education and we all want to see our children in schools, no more so than teachers themselves, we must recognise that schools are part of our community. They are vulnerable to the transmission of the virus, and they are part of the transmission of the virus. And we need to take all steps that we're taking, recognising that. So we do need to know, Minister, what the health and scientific advice is at present in terms of beyond the 11th of January, but also when you received the advice and that's about schools opening, because while we all want to see schools open, it must be absolutely safe for them to do so, and they must be operating in a way which makes it safe. Minister, at the very start of this pandemic, the World Health Organization issued guidance, and Mike Ryan in particular said that the enemy in terms of dealing with a virus and a pandemic is delay. He said you have to act fast. That advice applies to education just as it does to health. And I think we have too often seen where we have responded slowly here. We have seen where we have been too slow at times to close schools when it was necessary. We have been too slow at times to deal with the exam situation. We have indeed been too slow at times to put in place, and still are, too slow to put in place a proper find, test, trace, isolate and support system that is effective across the community, but also that supports the continuing education needs and that doesn't put teachers or children in vulnerable situations. We have been slow to see that blended learning approach, which schools are ready and welcome to embrace, being used in order to prevent further needs, further increases in transmission of COVID-19. And this is all in the context, Minister, where we have a fully devolved education and a fully devolved health system. So we do have the opportunity to move quickly, to be agile, to take measures which are appropriate to what's happening here and appropriate to the needs of our community. And I think we have at times squandered that ability. I think we need to see much more appropriate steps being taken and being taken faster in terms of what we're actually doing here. And if we're delaying the reopening of schools, that delay needs to be for a purpose. We need to be doing things with the time that we're putting in place. So we need to see better space within schools. We need to see that access to remote or blended learning being made available to all to ensure that we don't increase inequalities in education, as we have seen increasing in health. We need to see ventilation issues being addressed in schools. We need to see, as I mentioned earlier, the test and trace system put in place in schools to let them get on with the education, and the public health authorities to deal with the fine test trace. So we need to see all of these things happening. Too often, in my view, we have seen where we have waited for others to lead, and we have then followed that lead. And if we are going to, I first of all think that we should be leading ourselves. No reason why we can't be doing that with devolved powers. But to follow England, which is actually one of the worst track records in the world, is to me actually a crucial mistake. So we need to tailor our solutions to the situation we're facing. And I suppose just to end, Minister, in the Irish language, the word for minister is Ira, as you may or may not know, but you will hear it occasionally here in the chamber. The word is Ira. Ira has two other meanings in the Irish language, and they're relevant here. The second meaning of Ira is to take care of someone or to protect them. And the third meaning of Ira means to listen to pay heed to, or to pay attention to advice. And Minister, we need you to absolutely be a minister in every one of those senses of the word.
Thank you. And I call William Humphrey.
Can I start off by thanking the Minister for coming to the House and for coming to the Education Committee on countless occasions. I'm not sure where this urban myth out there that the Minister doesn't make himself available to the committee. Simply not true. And I thank the Minister for that. Can I also start off by congratulating Mr Derek Baker, who recently retired as the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Education, who did so much for our young people's education across Northern Ireland, on his honour in Her Majesty's New Year's honour list announced last night. Mr Speaker, COVID has presented challenges for all across our nation and its people, and indeed no home has been left untouched, some of them tragically the loss of life. Slowing down and elimination of this awful pandemic must be our aim. Slowing down and the elimination of this awful pandemic must be our aim, and we surely must work together to do so. Collaborative working across government is essential. For government ministers across governments and jurisdiction, this pandemic has forced many into the most difficult and unenviable choices. The view of the education and school closures is uppermost, I believe, in this Minister's thoughts and his decision-making. I commend all ministers. Surely we are all, sadly, too keen and too swift to criticise in this House in particular. And as I've said before in committee, I find sometimes members are keen to criticise ministers in other parties as opposed to their own. Each and every minister has difficult decisions to make. As a governor in 2 schools, I commend principals, teachers, classroom assistants, and all indeed involved in the day-to-day running of our schools for the work that they've done across education in Northern Ireland, and for governors for the difficult decisions that they also have had to make. Each of them, each and every one of them, are to be thanked and commended by the young people and their parents for the role they've given and the leadership they've provided in our community. Like many of you, and as Mr Bradley said, I have received much correspondence around this issue from teachers, trade unions and parents, and it is fair to say that the bag is a mixed bag. As with everything, ministers are faced with difficult challenges and competing choices, and COVID provides a particularly difficult challenge for ministers. Many share the view that children are best placed in the classroom. I agree with that, in terms of not just their education, but their general well-being, mindfulness, social interaction and development. As I've said, I share this view, and I would like to think that view is shared across this House. Others take the view that remote learning can and does work, and I have no doubt that it can and does, given the right circumstances, familial support, technology, space and environment. But what of those young children who can't and won't be able to have those resources and support in place? Recently I became aware of a young couple in North Belfast with 3 children with autism. They were terrified if schools were closed and the effect it was going to have on their young children who need that routine each day. So I commend the Minister for the decision he's made around the issue of special educational needs, as such as the young family I refer to, and the challenges that they were facing and the fears that they had for their children. Yes, sure.
Thank the member for giving way. And special educational needs is obviously an issue that the Education Committee has prioritised. The return to special schools on Monday the 4th of January will, however, have some concern, particularly for staff. Does the member agree that testing, vaccination, additional support for our special schools are needed to ensure the safety of all children and young people in them?
Member has
yes,
a minute.
Yes, and I think this is something which we have discussed in committee, and members have all agreed that point before. I thank the member for his intervention, and I wouldn't think anyone across the House would disagree with it. This motion calls for the Education Minister to clarify work that has been undertaken with the Department of Health on protecting children, teachers, parents and the wider public from COVID-19. We all must see a greater working and collaboration across government. This virus demands it. As I've said before, it is a balance. Many families, particularly young families, are struggling. Many employers will face difficult, hard choices. Many lives and livelihoods will be affected negatively when the furlough scheme comes to an end. This new strain and the appearance that it spreads, particularly across younger people, provides a new threat. So therefore, government needs to be nimble and reactive in a way as never before, even during this pandemic over this last 10 months. There are many difficult choices, and government must be responsive and responsible in those choices. So therefore, a close and meaningful and ongoing relationship between the Department of Education and the Department of Health is not desirable, but in the interest of people of Northern Ireland, but it is essential. This is a highly dangerous situation. All across government must be flexible and responsive. 2,100 of our people yesterday were tested positive for this virus. Far too many people have lost their lives and too many families affected. But of course, the other pandemic facing Northern Ireland is that of mental health and general well-being. That is a huge issue and a growing issue in our community, as many families, young families in particular, and parents face the challenges not just of education, but of poverty, of food shortages, and of the loss of employment and the loss of the opportunity to generate wealth. Those are things that are threatening our community, which require government at all levels to work across. I wish the Minister and his colleagues well, but this is something which has to be tackled by everyone being responsible across this House.
Thank you, and I call earlier Flynn.
I rise today to speak in support of the motion that's been tabled, in particular on the need for clarity from the Education Minister regarding the return of schools in January. The Education Minister has very recently provided some clarity on the return of schools and the decision not to open primary and post-primary next week in light of the deteriorating COVID-19 pandemic. However belated, it is an important announcement and I welcome it. Sinn Féin have consistently said that we will follow the scientific and health advice in how we respond to the pandemic, and this applies in the context of the schools opening. It's important to recognise that health isn't just physical, it's also mental, and we need to protect the mental health and the well-being of our children, as well as their physical health and that of their parents and of all of the school staff in the context of our school settings during this pandemic. In October this year, the Youth Wellbeing Survey found that rates of anxiety and depression were around 25% higher in the north compared to Britain, and there were differences between the most deprived areas compared with the least deprived areas. And I think this is really stark, especially when we already know that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on deprived communities here. Some children will undoubtedly have experienced anxiety during this pandemic when they have already spent many weeks away from school, away from their friends and away from their normal routine of studies, worried about how to prepare for their exams and the implications that it might have for them, and without that support from their friends who may have shared similar worries but they're unable to communicate with one another in that same way the kids would be used to. Similarly, there is anxiety experienced by those with children of special educational needs. And it's been mentioned already in the chamber that those kids, obviously, they need that routine of school. That's really important within their lives. There's also going to be anxiety amongst those for whom childcare and the absence of school is going to be really problematic. But there's also considerable anxiety for pupils, parents and teachers who are or who live with clinically vulnerable people as they go to school every day while cases of COVID in the north increases significantly. In addition to that, we need to consider the implications for the spread of the virus on all of us, including the added risk, as has been mentioned, from the new strains of COVID-19 and particularly the one that's gripped Britain. So there are no easy answers with regards to school openings during the current wave of this virus. However, I think that the ongoing confusion and slowness in decision-making with the Department of Education is compounding some of that stress and anxiety that's already being experienced by children, parents and school staff. And while the Minister's recent statement does provide some clarity in the short term with regards to the first week of school term, there is still much uncertainty as to the way forward and with regards to what contingencies are going to be put in place for schools, particularly in the event that the situation that we're in, and hopefully not, but that this situation further deteriorates. So as a few other members have already referenced, and it's referenced in the motion, I think this is why the Education Minister needs to be really clear with our parents, our school leaders, in regards to the scientific and the public health advice that the Minister's received from the Department of Health. What that specific advice was from the Department of Health and when the Minister received it, because the health and the scientific advice must be the basis of our approach going forward. And just as in reference to my earlier comments, in protecting not just the physical impacts that this is going to have, this coronavirus is having on our society, but also the mental health of our young people and their parents and their families and all the school staff.
Thank you. And I call Justin McNulty.
I thank the Speaker and thank all the members for supporting our SDLP recall petition and allowing us to hold the Minister to account on this most important of issues. And we must take a moment to thank our teachers, to thank our school staff, and put ourselves in their shoes, going into a classroom with 30 plus pupils on a daily basis, fearing for their own health, fearing for the health of their families, and still doing it because they believe passionately in educating our young people. Those teachers, those school staff, those principals should be applauded. Minister, I think it's abhorrent that we're here today discussing this on New Year's Eve. We've been banging the drum on these issues over and over and over again at Education Committee, here at ad hoc committees, at the Minister's questions, via written Minister's questions, and we haven't got the answers. And it's sad that it's come to today for this to happen. I'm really worried today, Minister. I'm really worried. I'm really worried about vulnerable children. I'm really worried about at-risk children. Children whose safe haven is school. I'm really worried about children with special educational needs. I'm really worried about children who do not have education support at home and are from disadvantaged backgrounds. I'm really worried about the mental health and the emotional health and the physical health of children and young people. We all do recognise that the best place for children is at school, but we also recognise the galloping couple figures have forced this issue and forced this move.
Will never give way.
Of course.
I thank the member for giving way. Does the member also recognise that the reason we're in this situation is because this minister hasn't acted quickly enough throughout this pandemic to put in place mitigations, protections and resources so that schools can continue educating our children in a safe environment?
Member has an additional minute.
Absolutely agree. Just as recently as last week, Minister, or just over a week ago, I was banging this drum again, asking you what are the mitigations, what are the contingency plans, and that detail wasn't forthcoming and hasn't been forthcoming and still isn't there. So, what are those mitigations? I ask you again, Minister, what are the mitigations to be put in place to allow children to be educated safe, to keep teachers safe, keep school staff safe, to keep families and parents safe? And what are the resources? Of course.
I know that the member shares with me the concern of those children who are at school on a regular basis, but who are at risk in their own homes. 2,000 children across Northern Ireland. And indeed, we'll have noticed the Barnardo's adverts where a child is pleading in the advert to be allowed to return to school. Would the member agree with me that indeed the partnership that the Minister has explained with health should be extended to include the beefing up or the professionalism or increased professionalism of the family intervention teams, along with between the health and education, to address the issue of at-risk children?
Thank the member for his contribution. I agree fully. However, the Minister must take responsibility in this regard too. The Minister is responsible for ensuring every child is safe. He has a role to play in ensuring every child is safe. In terms of the transfer test, Minister, I applaud the brave move by the principals in Newry, in the Abbey, St Colman's, Our Lady's and Sacred Heart. Their decision was a brave and early decision when it wasn't popular for many quarters, but it was the right decision. Now, we've heard much about a level playing field. How is there a level playing field across this part of the island? There was a lack of leadership and there's a lack of consistency. And Minister, that is down to you. That is down to you. I'm sorry, I can't give way because we're running out of time. I can't give way anymore. Minister, is it fair to say you haven't put children first? You've put your political allegiances first. We needed leadership and we needed a consistent approach, and that has not happened. Vaccinations, Minister. What pressure are you bringing to bear on the Health Minister to ensure there is a prioritisation of teaching staff to enable our schools to get back open as close to normal as quickly as possible? What pressure have you brought to bear on the Health Minister to ensure there is that prioritisation, especially for staff in special schools? There's a widening education gap. How will that be addressed, Minister? Parents at home now with their heads in their hands because they recognise the impact this closure will have on their children, especially those children with special education needs. Children see their children falling further behind. Minister, what additional resources will you bring to bear to help those children catch up? What additional resources will you give teachers to support them in enabling those children to catch up? What additional resources will be put in place, Minister, to enable the support for children whose mental health, whose emotional health, whose physical health has been adversely impacted by this pandemic and by this latest closure? Now we recognise that closure has been necessitated, but what additional resources will be brought forward to help teachers, to help staff, to ensure children can catch up and ensure their mental health, their physical health and their emotional health has not been too adversely impacted? Minister, I support the motion as amended.
Thank you. And I call Mike Nesbitt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I declare an interest as Chair of the Board of Movilla High School in Newton Ards and would like to put on record my admiration for the Principal, Mr Bell, the senior leadership team, the teachers and the non-teaching staff for providing a continuity of teaching and learning through this health crisis. I do wonder what this session is intended to achieve. Is it just to give the Minister a verbal beating? And if it is, fair enough. I suppose that's part of the political mix. And I know there are many who think the Minister deserves a verbal beating. But surely there's more to it than that. When we sit in committee, as we all do, we have a statutory duty to assist and to advise ministers in their work. And to do that, and I would like to assist and advise this minister, it's essential to have a little more information about his thinking. So, for example, as I understand it, his original intention was children would go back to school for a couple of weeks to allow teachers to prepare to deliver remote learning. But now, because of changing circumstances, they get 2 days to prepare for remote learning. So I would like the Minister in his remarks perhaps to expand on his thinking with regard to that change and the impact and the challenge that that presents to teachers such as the teachers I represent at Movilla High School. The second issue is a concern I have about whether the transfer tests will go ahead as scheduled. Now, I think we're all used to risk assessment graphs where the horizontal axis gives us an assessment of how likely an adverse event is to happen, 0 being not likely, 5 being almost certain. And the vertical graph gives us assessment of the impact should it happen, 0 being not very likely, 5 being potentially calamitous. I would like to know where the dot is in terms of the department's risk assessment of those exams not going ahead. Because I suspect we're much closer to 5-5 than to 0-0. So I'd really appreciate it if the Minister could say where the dot is and what the contingency plan is should it come to pass. I think that's very important for us in terms of being able to assist and advise the Minister in his work, particularly the committee chaired by Mr. Lyttle. Yep.
Just on that point of the testing, would the member agree with me that there's another further question that primary schools will want answered with regard to whether they can open to provide help for children who may be sitting the tests very soon?
The member has an additional minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his intervention, and I look forward to the Minister addressing that as well. There's just one other issue that I would like to raise. I'm not going to use all my time, but it's with regard to following scientific and medical advice. Because I note, Mr. Speaker, there are some politicians today saying teachers should be prioritised for the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, of course, I would like teachers to get the vaccine as soon as possible. I would like everybody to get it as soon as possible. But in the real world, we have to have a list. We have to have priorities. And if we are truly going to follow the scientific and medical advice, then we follow the advice of the Joint Committee on Vaccines and Immunisation, JCVI. And here's what they say, and I want to read this into the record, if I may, Mr. Speaker. The committee considered evidence on the risk of exposure and risk of mortality by occupation. Under the priority groups advised below, those over 50 and all those 16 and over in a risk group would be eligible for vaccination within the first phase of the programme. This prioritisation captures almost all preventable deaths from COVID-19, including those associated with occupational exposure to infection. As such, JCVI does not advise further prioritisation by occupation during the first phase of the programme. Clear, open, transparent, scientific and medical advice. So are we following it, or do we only follow it when it suits a party political agenda? I give way.
I thank the member for giving way on that point, and I'm glad he raised that issue of the JCVI, because obviously there is that official list and scientific backing to the order that people will receive vaccination or will be offered vaccination. And it is worth mentioning that I think one solution in all of this would be actually, as far as possible, would be to speed up that vaccination process. So I want to ask the member if he'd agree with me that this House should be supporting the Minister of Health in giving him every resource that he needs in order to roll out the vaccine much quicker than it's already very quick, and that's very, very welcome. But possibly we could do it even quicker with a bit more resource and a bit more thinking behind it, so that everybody that wants the vaccination could receive that even quicker than is already planned.
And I thank the member for her intervention, and I 100% support the Minister. I know Mr Swann will roll out the vaccine as quickly as he can, and it will be quicker with the full support of the Northern Ireland Executive and his ministerial colleagues. Mr. Speaker, I finish by wishing this House and indeed society a happier new year in 2021. Mr. Humphrey was modest in congratulating Mr. Baker. He too is on the New Year's honours list, and I congratulate him for that. Members, let's work together on this. Happy New Year.
Okay, thank you. On that note, John O'Dowd.
Thank you, Concordia. I think it's a very sad day. It's a very worrying day. And the fact that we're now closing our schools again is an acknowledgement that despite measures that have been taken, COVID-19 is rapidly spreading in our society. There are many vulnerable people at risk of dying, and our health service is at risk of being overrun if it's not already been overrun. So this day, I think at the end of an awful year, it perhaps marks what this year has been about missed opportunities, about lives being put on hold and lives being lost. And I look at my own children. I'm a father and I'm a legislator, but I look at my own children and I am worried about them. I'm worried about them missing out on education. I'm worried about their mental health and well-being. And my children are lucky because they are in a loving, caring family. The heating will be on today. There's food in the cupboard. They will have access to electronic devices for their education. But the reality is that there's thousands of children today who do not have those luxuries. Well, food is not a luxury. Food's a right. Heating's a right. Very quickly, yeah.
He makes a very salient point, and it's the point that a principal in my constituency made to me was for many of these children, school is the only normality in their day, unfortunately. And it is, some other members said, the only square meal they get in the day. And we need to be mindful of those things when these decisions are made. Very difficult decisions that have been made, and all of these things have to be taken into consideration.
Member has yes. A minute.
And I also have to put on record declaring interest as a Vice Chair of a Board of Governors as well. So I am very concerned about where society is going, where we're going in regards to this COVID-19 infection rates. My colleague, the Chair of the Health Committee, pointed out that there has been missed opportunities, and in particular, the failure to put in place a proper test and tracing regime in our society, in my opinion, has led to a continued wider spread of the virus. Anyone who's planning a New Year's Eve party tonight, I'll be perfectly honest with you, I hope the police knock on your door. Because you're putting yourselves at risk, you're putting other members of society at risk, and you are denying our children education. So if you're planning a party, please don't do it. If the police knock on your door, they're very right to knock on your door, and you should be duly dealt with through the legal process. Because how dare you place society's health at risk, and how dare you deny our children education? But we as legislators have responsibilities as well. And I think the Minister has responsibilities in this. I quote, the Minister may be familiar with this quote, "We are not calendar-led, we are condition-led." You may recall that was the DUP's battle cry in 2006 during the negotiations which led to the establishment of these institutions. But it would appear now that the DUP are calendar-led. To set a date and time and say schools will return on the 4th of January was not realistic. And we've seen it time and time again. We've seen it after the summer break, we've seen it in October, and we've seen it in November again, where the DUP would set dates and time. Restrictions will be lifted on such and such a date. We will only have a 2-week lockdown. Folks, the COVID-19 virus does not work to school timetables. It is not realistic, Minister, for you to say that schools will reopen in a normal fashion in a week's time, or 2 weeks' time, or 3 weeks' time. You have to plan for the potential that schools will remain closed for a significant period of time. You have to plan for it. And the DUP in general have to accept that we may be in restrictions for a significant period of time, and that setting a date in the calendar isn't going to work for us. So let's work on that basis. And the reason why I say you have to plan for it, Minister, is this. Blended learning, what is it? What does that mean in reality for many, many young people out there? Parents are educators, but they're not teachers. Parents cannot be expected to be the teachers of our children. We rely on our teaching profession to do that, so they need support to be able to provide online learning to our pupils. That online learning also needs to be quality controlled, and there needs to be quality checks of it, and we need to ensure that is quality delivery into our children's homes. So, Minister, you have a lot of planning to do. Do not think for 1 second our schools will open on a date because you have said it. And what concerns me most, Minister, is this. You have set your agenda in regards to the 9th of January. Transfer tests. Our education system for generations was planned around the 11+. We reached the stage at a certain part of the year where a section of the class was set at the back of the classroom with colouring pencils and a colouring book and told to colour in while the rest of the class were educated. Minister, please do not go back to that mentality, where we now have an education system in the middle of a COVID-19 crisis being directed towards the needs of the minority instead of the majority. Many tell us we have to follow the scientific advice in relation to COVID, and they're absolutely right. Why don't we follow the evidence in relation to academic selection? Why do we not listen to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child,
Members' time's up.
the OECD and the Equality and Human Rights Commissions? It's time, Minister, to educate everyone, not just a few.
Kelly Armstrong.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I haven't written a speech because, to be honest, I have received so many emails from parents over the last few days, my head was spinning. So all I can do is to declare an interest as a parent of a pupil in an exam year and as a member of the Board of Governors of Strangford College and Portaferry Integrated Primary School. But what I can say as a parent of an exam year student is mental health is a problem for our young people. I absolutely agree that they should be in school when they are safe to be in school, but can I say that the mental health of teenagers is being fundamentally harmed by the dithering and the not knowing and the trying to guess what the heck is going to come next. COVID is at the core of all of this, but Minister, honestly, it is time to take leadership and to be clear and honest with our pupils and our teachers. Today is the last working day before schools are returning. And today is the day that our heads and our teachers get the announcement. I think we owe them an apology. I think as an assembly we should be saying sorry to putting that pressure onto our teachers, because tomorrow will not be a bank holiday for them. It will not be a celebration of a New Year's Day. They will be planning what the heck is going to happen next week. I'm quite happy to say sorry to our teachers, to our classroom assistants and to those pupils. I think it was left far, far too late for this decision. Scotland were able to plan ahead, Wales were able to plan ahead. We had to wait until Westminster finally gave the go-ahead before we did something here. I'll take everyone back to scientific advice that has been called for, or the information that's been called for in the motion today. And I do ask you, Minister, to give us an outline of the scientific and medical advice that you have been provided with, including what SAGE said in December. I also would ask you to clarify the work that you have been doing with the Minister for Health, and thank you for that. But Mr Bradley had referred to CAMHS. Where are they? Because, to be honest, I can't get a hold of them for love and their money, and I appreciate that CAMHS is underfunded. It is up to the executive to make sure that they have enough funding. But our pupils are looking for mental health support, and we can't get it. We can't even get it through schools, because the family support networks that were put in place for those young people are not there because of COVID. So I ask you to clarify what that medical and scientific advice is. Can I also ask you, Minister, we talked, and Mr Nesbitt mentioned earlier about the vaccination programme. I do actually consider teachers to be key workers, but in particular the teachers of special education needs. They are key workers. They are the very people who are working with some of the most vulnerable children across society. Where are they in the lists? Where are they in the vaccination programme? Can you please clarify what work has been done with health to discuss those teachers? Because those pupils are going back next week. Those pupils will be in school. Some of those pupils have both physical and mental health issues, and some of those children can be very ill. To catch COVID is life-ending. So I would ask why vaccination programme hasn't included. And to those who talk about, the JCVI, if I've got that right, Northern Ireland is not included in that list. We're taking note of it and we're following that advice. Northern Ireland can actually change our vaccination priorities to include special education needs teachers, classroom assistants. The other thing is as well, Minister, you talk about vulnerable children. I'm very glad to see that there will be support for vulnerable children. However, I speak day in, day out, weekends, everything, with parents of people of children who cannot get educational psychologist support to have a statement made. So those children are being denied access to schools. They're not being classified as vulnerable children. They don't have the opportunity because they're not getting access to educational psychologists. We know that you're recruiting more, but oh my goodness, this is just so frustrating. Our special education needs are some of the most oversubscribed schools. In particular, I'll mention Collard House School, fabulous school, who could be filled 4 times over. Where do those children go? They go into mainstream, and if they can't get a statement, that's it, they're left out. I will.
The member also agree that mitigations around school transport, particularly special school transport, will be essential to limit the transmission of the virus.
The member has in a minute.
Thank you. To be honest, you get my geek up when you start talking about transport. When somebody has their head right at the knee of a person attaching their wheelchair to the floor of a bus, of course that person is coming into close contact, and why wouldn't they receive a vaccine? What I would also ask, Minister, is, it's been mentioned by others here today, we have GCSEs coming up starting from, I believe, the 11th of January. We still don't know what the COVID tariff is going to be. Has the CCEA provided you with any contingency plans? Because I know that that would be one thing that would finally help some of those teenagers who are driving their parents to distraction. What is happening with that COVID tariff? We have a week now where those pupils may or may not be in school, depends on the school, whether or not they're going to hold any classes for those children. They have remote learning. So there's a lot of questions here, and that's why I'm glad that we have the motion today. I'm sad that we had to bring the Minister to the House in this way. It is a difficult time for everyone, but I think it's time that we recognised that our teachers have been just put under one of the most intense amounts of stress that we could have ever put on them, and we didn't have to do this. We could have said before Christmas that we knew rightly this was going to happen. We knew that there was going to be problems. So, Minister, I ask you today, please give us some clarity. Please explain exactly what that medical advice was, and please be fair to our pupils.
Member's time's up, thank you. And I call Colm McCrossan.
Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to participate in this debate today. And first of all, I want to highlight that I am saddened and dismayed and somewhat depressed that we're having to have this debate today. The Minister has had to be proverbially trailed here, kicking and screaming, and this is the third such time that this Minister has had to be brought back to this House to discuss the decisions that he has or hasn't taken, much to the dismay of those working in the various sectors. And that reflects to me that this Minister is failing the sector that he is there to protect. Now, a recall, as we know, is used when a Minister is not listening, not doing what is reasonably asked of them, and when they refuse to listen to logic and sense. And I fear that in this instance, we have a Minister that is out of touch, out of his depth and out of tune with the thoughts and concerns of the people in the education sectors. That's the parents, the teachers, the support staffs, the union and indeed the children. Now, this Minister had told us up until 7:30 a.m. this morning that schools are safe places. He had said that schools are the best place for our children and that hard-working parents need somewhere to send their children to. But the Minister himself had stated in the last ad hoc committee that schools are not safe places. Yet he has now introduced a number of changes that go nowhere near far enough to address the issues that parents, principals, teachers, unions and children have highlighted. Minister, you are failing them all. Now, his arguments could work, delivering education in the classroom, if this Minister and his department did something, anything to help make those schools safer than anywhere else. Yep, sure.
I thank the member for giving way. Would the member agree with me that in many ways what's happened thus far is too little too late?
Thank the member for intervention. And I think that is pretty much the mantra of this Minister. It's too little, too late. That is what we've seen through the whole 10 months of this pandemic. Mr Speaker, the special needs sector is a specific strand of the education establishment, and it is quite bespoke in its delivery. Parents, principals and teachers from this sector have raised their concerns and want to see them addressed as well. Now, I welcome that the special needs sector will open on Monday, because much of their work is as much therapeutic as it is educational. But they need to have their questions answered too. What protections are there for the staff that are there? Are there any special mitigations for them? Is the transportation issue being delivered correctly and safely? There was figures released yesterday that indicate that 3 times as many cases of COVID in the special needs schools are in the staff than there is in the children. So what has been done to protect the staff in that sector? As ever, we see from the Minister half a decision, which leaves us with more questions than answers. And what of the children who have special needs but attend mainstream schools? What protections are there in place for them? When do they restart? What will they do next week? And if they don't attend next week, then what do they do at home? What extra support is there in place for them? Again, what we get is half a decision, which leaves us with more questions and answers, and that is totally failing the children of Northern Ireland. Mr Speaker, it is worth remembering that we do not want to see schools closing. The SDLP is not here to shut schools. It's quite the opposite. We want to see schools opened, but done so safely. But how do our principals that must reopen, as directed to them by the ministerial decision today, prepare for Monday to reopen safely? Today is New Year's Eve. Tomorrow is New Year's Day, and then it's the weekend. One principal contacted me today and said, pass on our thanks to the Minister for managing to wreck whatever New Year's Eve principals were going to have with their families. Failing the sector once again with last-minute, knee-jerk reactions rather than being planned and strategic. The Minister would do well to remember the old adage. Mr Speaker, the Minister has 2 ears and 1 mouth because he's expected to do twice as much listening as talking. I suggest, Mr Speaker, that this Minister goes out, engages with the principals, engages with the teachers, the unions and the parents, and even the pupils, because there's a secondary school students' union and it's headed up by one of my constituents, Cormac Savage. Listen to what they are saying. Yes?
I thank the member for giving way. Will the member agree with me that it is entirely regrettable that the Minister for Education waited until yesterday to engage with the Minister for Health, the CMO and CSO regarding reducing the risk of COVID in schools, particularly after warnings for weeks from the Education Committee and members of this House?
Minister, a member hasn't. Yeah, you already had it. Sorry.
I thank the member for the intervention. Yeah, again, too little, too late. That's what we hear time and time again from the sector. They are not given the time to prepare and to be able to deliver. But as I say, if you engage with all of those sectors, you will hear that what they are saying, and it is the same as us. We want the schools to reopen, but we want them to be safe. We want our children to learn, but not to compromise their safety to do so. We want them to be educated, but not in a manner that endangers their educators. We want them to learn. This Minister needs to learn too. Stop failing the education sector and learn to listen to it and do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Rachel Woods. And could I ask the member to remind herself that the longer you take, the less time Mr Carroll will have to speak, and I want to try and maximise the time each member has to speak.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think it could have been said to other MLAs beforehand, but it is somewhat of a déjà vu that we're here today when it comes to our schools in this pandemic. We have been here before. Earlier on this year, schools and parents took it upon themselves to take their children out of the physical building, and then to be told weeks later at the end of March the schools will close and children should stay at home. They heeded calls not to send their children to school, even if they were not designated as key workers. But many had already made that decision to do so, and well before the executive had moved, being somewhat behind the curve in decision making. And this week they were doing the same. Many pupils were not going back to the classroom next week, regardless of any decision taken by the Minister this morning. And some children have had to spend their holidays preparing for AQE tests, which I note in the announcement is being pushed ahead with. Why is it, Mr Speaker, that exams are to go ahead in light of all this? We have not got view of the scientific or medical evidence and advice received that it is safe for these schools to reopen for the children, teachers, staff, assistants, bus drivers, chefs and cooks, lollipop men and women and so on to attend on the 11th of January, let alone what mitigations are in place above and beyond what is there at the moment to reduce the spread of COVID during the period in which the students and staff are required to be in the buildings. What is going to change week after next? Has there been additional resources given to schools, to pupils? Any guidance? What about our SEN pupils then? What about the most disadvantaged or vulnerable accessing blended learning, as Mr Butler has already outlined? I do note that the childcare provision is to remain open, which is crucial, and I do welcome this. But has there been additional support given to those key workers who are looking after our children? Some are worried about people mixing with pupils who have been mixing with others over this festive period, when infection rates, as we know, are increasing. One suggested a phased return that contacted me with different year groups or different bubbles returned from the middle of January. Can this be considered, Minister, going forward, and will people be given enough notice? What additional resources can be put in place to ensure children and young people's safety and also support for their mental and emotional health? As many will know, in the last Northern Ireland Youth Forum survey, 67% of the thousands of respondents identified education and learning as a key theme that they were worried about. And also in terms of COVID, 45% said that they did not feel safe in their workplace, school or college. And I want to ask, Minister, what, if any, engagement, conversation and consultation has there been with children and young people on this, whose voices deserve and must be heard? And I hope the Minister will do a youth press conference, perhaps to answer these important questions. There is a lack of a coherent plan, and the Executive are clearly not speaking with one voice on this. Then there's the timing of the announcement, only a few days to go before the start of term. So I would like to ask if the Minister is engaged with schools, the boards of government, the governors, the teaching unions, the parents and the pupils on this decision. If not, when will he do so, and when will his department be doing so? Is 5 days enough for parents to make arrangements for childcare? We know we need the details, we need clarity, and we need the Executive to follow the scientific and medical evidence. We need a clear plan, and we also need to see the evidence being published. But if that's not possible, then we need an expert-led COVID task force to do so if we are to curb COVID-19 through effective decision-making processes and a coherent response. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you very much, and I call Jerry Carroll.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it is utterly disgraceful that the Education Minister dug his heels in for so long, stubbornly refused to listen to the Health Minister, CMO, Chief Scientific Officer, SAGE and many other people, and keep schools running as per normal in the middle of a pandemic that is sweeping through our communities, taking the lives of workers, including education workers. And true to form and true to his tenure as Education Minister this year, performed another U-turn which has caused increased anxiety for those in education. Because the reality is, this Minister, indeed this House, knew the cases had been rising at an exponential rate in the last few weeks. And whilst the Executive handling of this pandemic has been a disaster, Mr Weir certainly topped the class for incompetency, for sure. How many U-turns has he performed this year? Too many to count. More U-turns than Mickey Morley's roundabout. The Minister isn't fit for the job. This is people's lives we're talking about here. We're talking about protecting those in our schools from a deadly virus and a new variant of it, which is spreading at a much quicker rate through our communities. This motion rightly references the concerns of teachers, pupils and parents, and these voices have essentially been ignored and sidelined throughout this pandemic by the Minister. And this latest U-turn by the Minister has been forced in part by the pressure of those organisations, the unions representing teachers and education workers, and I want to thank them for their work, and I want to say to them directly, if this Minister continues to put you and pupils at risk, I wholeheartedly support you taking action, including walking out or refusing to go into unsafe working conditions, and I hope other members would stand by you as well. I've said repeatedly that this Executive has too often, Mr Speaker, followed the Tory approach to tackling this crisis, but the Education Minister has really turned that into a virtue and certainly wins the award for being an ardent Tory follower. Again, he only acts after a Tory Minister belatedly acts, refusing to listen to the concerns of those who know the day-to-day reality of working in education and those who know the reality of this virus and what it represents. And what message does it send to all those education workers that the Minister waits until the final day of the year, only a few days before schools were due to reset, to announce this backtracking? wait until the 11th hour again, as I and many others predicted this situation would likely occur. And no bland statements about people needing access to education will suffice here. We know the importance of education, but to repeat, we are dealing with a pandemic. I will give away.
Agree with me as a suggestion that maybe the Minister should spend a week or two in the classroom surrounded by 30 kids with no protections, mitigations or resources in place, just to see what our teachers and school children are going through?
Can I remind the member you have about a minute left?
Okay, thank you. I would certainly support that recommendation and suggestion. We know the importance of education, but we are dealing with a pandemic, to repeat, that has ripped through our communities. And of course, the classroom is an important part of education in normal times, but it shouldn't be the only method of education. And what the Minister's approach is ultimately doing is defending the system that is already failing so many people in our society. It's quite ironic that the Minister and his party often talks about working class Protestants being failed by the education system, but is willing to defend that system even in the middle of a pandemic. And the Minister effectively operating on the basis that school children aren't at risk from this virus, previously sneering at my suggestion many months ago about pupils wearing masks on public transport, then eventually ceding to that request. And we have seen in England, obviously, the risk of pupils being the second highest infection group primary age children being the second highest infected group of people, and the rates rising there. And the Minister has taken some belated action to push back the opening date of schools. The reality is that it's likely to be nowhere near enough in a situation where this executive is saying to work at home if you can, where all but essential services are closed until at least the end of January at the earliest. Why is it willing, and the Minister willing, to put at risk the health and lives of so many of their education workers and their families? The Minister isn't fit for the job. You should step aside, and if you don't, you should be forced to do so. Thank you.
Members, as the amendment was tabled, in my head, I call the Minister for Education, Peter Weir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maybe at the outset, I'd also echo the remarks of, first of all, thank those who've taken part in this debate. Many of whom have made very cogent and valued contributions. I think there has been an element of ping-pong coming across the table in relation to this. Perhaps that's maybe not unexpected. Kind of at the outset, I suppose, place my thanks to all those within the education sector for all their work during this year as we enter the last day. I think it's important that we acknowledge that. I think all of us throughout society are working in very difficult circumstances, but I applaud the work that's been done in terms of meeting those challenges. Can I also, I think, add to others the congratulations, both to my colleague, Mr Humphrey, on his honour, and also the former Permanent Secretary, Derek Baker, on their honours, and indeed particularly those who have also received honours throughout the education system. Can I say at the outset, look, my priority is to try to ensure that we get the best possible education for our young people, that we sustain their life chances. So in terms of making my objective keeping schools open, keeping that face-to-face teaching, I make absolutely no apology for that. It is, I think, as Mr O'Dowd referred to, I agreed probably with the first half of his statement, at least in relation to that, a tragic day whenever action has to be taken of this nature, because it should be the last resort for any action taken to the level of disruption. I want to minimise that disruption as much as possible, because even with the situation, and even whatever measures can be put in place to support it, it is undoubtedly the case, either delayed openings, school closures, remote learning, blended learning, all these things are second best for our children. What delivers most is face-to-face teaching, and it's not simply the matter of whether there is a device in the household or indeed in relation to that. The response that children have from face-to-face teaching, there cannot be anything which is an adequate substitution for it. And indeed, whatever actions are taken, any disruption to education will hit most on those who are disadvantaged. Now, it is undoubtedly the case, even with remote learning, indeed any set of circumstances, that those who are from families that are best off financially and can provide that level of support, those who are the brightest amongst in the land, will always survive and maybe even thrive in those circumstances. But for those who are disadvantaged, for those who don't have that level of support, who will much more respond within the classroom, anything else is second best. So any action that is being taken has to be done with the highest level of reluctance. It is also the case that the members have said about listening. Now, I would say in terms of the committee, I think I've been at the committee more than 20 times during 2020. We may not always agree, but I think it is not the case that I am in some way devoid from being in front of the committee. I suspect, I haven't checked any figures, that is probably the most of any minister within this House. Well, I want to try and get through. Fair enough in that regard. Well, again, if and I think some members have been very balanced of what they've said. Again, if that was replicated elsewhere, maybe I'd be keener to give way at times. But what I would say is, in terms of listening, let us be under no illusion in terms of the issues that are out there, in terms of the issues of school reopening. There has been at times a presentation that there is some unified voice calling for one particular piece of course of action in relation to it. That is simply not the case. It may well be that the loudest voices will say a particular thing, but as any who have received, and as probably as Minister, I get more correspondence from individuals than anybody else. There's undoubtedly large numbers of teachers who will say, delay, we want further things happening, etc. There are some parents who will say that. It is undoubtedly the case that I've also had quite a lot of messages from teachers, from principals who've said, we want back on the 4th of January. That has been their fairly consistent position, and overwhelmingly from parents who do not want to see any level of interruption to their children's education. So if we're talking about listening, it is undoubtedly the case that there are a range of voices out there that need to be listened to. But critically, and I think at the heart of this, is listening to medical and scientific advice, listening when I get it and reacting and acting within that. Now, given the speed and course of the pandemic, I suppose one of the issues with that is that will mean at times changes have to be made, and may have to be made at very short notice because circumstances change greatly. But let me make it clear in terms of the discussions that I've had. I've worked closely with Rob and Swann, with the health officials, with the CMO and CSA. We worked closely before the executive agreed the position during the start of the summer in terms of initial levels of opening. When there was changes to be made in terms of moving towards full reopening in September, we worked closely with them, we took advice, we held discussions with them. Before even the recent statement on the 21st of December, there were discussions indeed on that very day with officials with CMO and CSA, and I spoke directly to the CMO. So throughout, any actions that have been taken have been the byproduct of that joint working, and that is undoubtedly the case with this decision as well. We faced a point at which the mitigations that had been mentioned, and indeed part of those were to allow, in terms of timing, levels of preparation, not just for, ideally for schools, but also for parents, but also perhaps an expectation that with the new variant that we may face into a situation where late January, February may be potentially a very dangerous situation as well. That indeed, since that position in the last 10 days, things have moved on and moved on dramatically. And most significantly, they have moved on with the situation as regards to the figures, which were a week or two ago running at around about, well, in the mid-400s. I think shortly before Christmas it was around about 700, but have now moved in a matter of a few days to over 2,000. Now, there's a slight element where statistically some of those there may be slight question marks over some of the figures on the basis that some of those are effectively delayed results. But there is no doubt that we are facing an unprecedented and deteriorating situation. It is clear with the vaccine coming that this will hopefully be something that is a relatively temporary position, but there's a major threat that is out there. With that in mind, and I've consistently said that I agree with the position of the Health Minister in terms of not reopening as normal. Both the Department and myself were contacted on Tuesday evening by the Health Minister, the CMO and CSA, saying that they believed that further measures needed to be taken. On that basis, we spent yesterday discussing and in consultation with them. There were meetings with initially between officials and CMO and CSA earlier on in the day, and then I had the opportunity to meet directly with and discuss the issue with the Minister for Health, the CMO and the CSA at 4 o'clock yesterday. So I appreciate one of the accusations will be that we are following England. It's very difficult, I have to say, but I'm not suggesting any blame on either side. If I'm meeting at 4 o'clock to try and then do something which is before what happened at 3:30 yesterday is a little bit difficult to do. We continue to work on that, and indeed in terms of the position as regards the statement on that was worked on until about midnight last night. The idea being to try and get these decisions out as quickly as possible given these circumstances. And we are seeing a deteriorating situation. I think it is believed that while the new variant is in Northern Ireland, indeed in all jurisdictions, it is undoubtedly, I think I would echo the words perhaps of Mr O'Dowd in relation to this, the key driver at the moment seems to have been the activities of people before Christmas. Some cases, the very irresponsible activities of people. Indeed, if people had behaved responsibly throughout this, we would be in a much stronger position. And I would also echo his remarks to very much heed the words of Chief Medical Officer, the Minister for Health, particularly as regards this evening. Stay at home. Do not have New Year's Eve parties. If you're potentially having one, cancel it. This is above all a time to act as responsibly as possible. And for all of us, it is not just the implications for us as individuals, but the implications that we have in terms of direct health threat to our elderly in particular, the most vulnerable within our society, and also the impact potentially that has down the line in terms of children's education. There is a choice for everyone in this society. You can play your part in combating the virus, or alternatively, you can take action to help prevent it. It is also the case, mention has been made of the SAGE paper. The SAGE paper, and there are probably some degrees of misunderstandings as regards this. As far as I'm aware, the latest SAGE paper was produced shortly before Christmas. I have seen that paper, I've read that paper, I've taken that into account as well. That paper, I suppose, highlighted some of the problems that were there, particularly with around children and young people. It did, however, it is not accurate to say that it made any form of recommendation for school closures. It highlighted both the problems that were there, but also the damage that would be done to young people by school closures. It also highlighted a number of other things. It is firstly the case, undoubtedly the case, and whether this is on a SAGE paper, whether it's internationally, that directly the clinical threat to children is extremely low. We know that in terms of the fact that of those who have died from the virus, over 90% have been 65 and over, and children are at a very low-risk group. It is also the case, and whether this is from the SAGE paper, from the advice of PHA, or indeed from international experience from the European Disease Control Centre, that there is nowhere that is risk-free, and I think anyone would entirely accept that. But, for example, in terms of education staff and teachers, there is no difference in terms of their level of COVID, those who have been positive for COVID, to the rest of society. There is clear evidence of very strong evidence at times of child-to-child transmission. There is considerable evidence of adult-to-adult transmission. It is relatively rare and very rare for any form of transmission between adults and children. It is also the case that if you talk closely to the Chief Medical Officer, Chief Scientific Advisor, indeed their concern around schools is not, and measures will be taken, if I get the chance I'll maybe outline some of those further, within the classroom. It is not basically what is happening in the classroom that is the problem. They will say very clearly that it is the behavioural aspects that happen outside the classroom. Indeed, SAGE were not able to distinguish in terms of the issue of children. What impact was there in terms of schools? What impact was there in terms of wider context? But it is issues around the fact that when schools are open, there's additional mobility. There is greater level of contact between adults. There is at times irresponsible behaviour at the school gates. It effectively frees up adults to be able to engage more socially. It also, I think, from that point of view, has led, particularly amongst some of the younger children, gives greater opportunities for a level of socialisation outside of schools. There's a tendency that there is a level of increased activity whenever children are at schools. I'm trying to get through a number of aspects in relation to that. So we do need to make it clear that while whatever additional measures can be taken, will be taken, it is not principally the problem of the structures that are within the school gates. It is what is happening beyond that. And indeed, trying to break the levels of contact and reduce the overall levels of contact is what is behind this. It is, in terms of, particularly in terms of the first week that is being targeted, a feeling, first of all, from the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor that is likely, in terms of where things have worked through from Christmas, to be the peak week It is the most important bit to keep people apart on that basis and to reduce levels of contacts within the community as a whole, which is why that has been targeted. But if we say that schools themselves are very much an at-risk place, yes, there's risk everywhere, but it is a relatively low risk compared to what is out there in the wider community, and that has not changed. Now, in terms of some of the mitigation measures that have been put in place, I mean, first of all, I would say mention has been made about catch-up, about mental health, and with the executive support, there's been 12 million put through to the Engage programme for that level of catch-up. Similarly, in terms of mental health and wellbeing, there's been an additional COVID recovery fund of around about 5 million that's been put in place directly on that front. But at best, if there was more money available, could more be done? I'm sure it could be. We have to live within the opportunities that are there as well. On the issue of vaccination, look, I would concur with what has been said in terms of I want to see, indeed, we're working with health to see what further can be done in terms of rollout of testing. In terms of vaccination, I'm very much at one with what people have said in terms of a level of prioritisation, particularly in terms of special schools and teachers. I have absolutely no problem with that. To be fair, though, and I want to make this clear, I've written to the Health Minister on this. I have urged this to be done. Certainly my understanding is that Northern Ireland is part of the four-nation, the JCVI, I'll remember they get the initials correct. So it is not something which entirely lies within the hands of the Health Minister, to be fair to him. And they have taken a view of, in terms of prioritisation, the clinical issue. And that overwhelmingly at the early stages will be on the aged population. You know, again, I give an indication that I think 2/3 of those that have died are over 80. Over 90% of those who've died are 65, and taking those people, because they are also the people who are most vulnerable to be seriously ill. But I would like to see teachers move as quickly as possible in terms of vaccination. Again, to be fair, I now seem to be defending very much the Health Minister today. You know, if there's any extra resources can speed up things, I think that is helpful. I think probably the key determinant in that will not be the availability of the logistics or the people. The principal determinant of that will be the extent of the vaccine that we get as part of the UK share. And I think there's a wider call to the UK government to take any action it can to actually speed up the amount that can be provided. I have no doubt that within Northern Ireland, everything will be done to then whatever is got that will be administered as quickly as humanly possible. But the sooner that can be done, I think, the better. In terms of the issue, one of the issues which I think has also been raised, the position as regards teaching, it would be, I think, to be fair, also impossible, and no one is suggesting this, that teachers in terms of vulnerable groups or key worker groups, and we saw in the first phase of this that there were relatively small numbers of those came in. They are not being asked to do face-to-face teaching and remote learning to the same people simultaneously. This would be, if you like, providing critically that space for those children to be directly in school. As mention has been made, for many vulnerable children, the risk, unfortunately, sometimes for some of them, in being at home is much greater than being in school. It's about providing that space. But in terms of equality of provision, it should not be, well, the provision in terms of a physical space, it is not a question of one group in, for example, a year 8 will be taught and the others will simply be produced with remote learning. There will be equality across the board in relation to that. In terms of the position, again, to clarify, on the examinations, particularly which will impact on years 11, 12 and 13. There is, in terms of GCSEs, around about, I think, 26,000 children who will be doing examinations between the 11th and the 14th of January. It may well be that in the first week, for many of those children, the best position is simply with remote learning, or indeed having a scenario in which revision is able to take place. But we are giving the flexibility. We're cognizant of the fact that it may well be that a range of schools will want to have, for example, a revision class in one of those bits, and will want to have that freedom of manoeuvre. So there is a level of flexibility. Similarly, I think, which I think maybe takes up the position Mrs Armstrong raised, in terms of year 11s, there will be some year 11s who are doing GCSEs in June. And again, there will be the flexibility given to schools that if for those cohorts, if during that 4-week period, because that would be covered during that, there will be some flexibility. In most cases, I think a lot of this will be covered by remote learning, and it may well be that schools may want to have some additional aspect. I should also point out The one other sort of slight variation is that in terms of an exam year, within the Dixon plan, Year 10 in junior highs is also counted as an exam year, so there will also be some level of additional flexibility. In terms of the issues around childcare, preschool and nurseries, again, this has been identified both in terms of the impact this would have on a broader societal level, quite often on young parents and some of the restrictions that we've put in place. But also it is clear that even with the new variant, that those children who are very young are not, generally speaking, impacted to the same extent. And certainly it is clear that the position from the medical side of it is they are relaxed about those being in place throughout. And I also take on board the position of the special schools. It is important, this is about 2% of the school population, that for many of those children, particularly those, for instance, with autism who need that routine, others who will depend upon the special school situation for medical interventions, or indeed quite often families who are highly dependent upon that. Now, that is not to say there will not be some, as in all aspects of this, that there will be some parents who will take a view that they want their child to be at home. Ultimately, that will be a decision for families, but the availability and indeed schools moving forward, if there is any level of additional measures that can be taken to support that, they will be. On a couple of aspects of interventions, we will be making it clear that in terms of face coverings within schools, that will apply now in lessons within all post-primary, at least for the period of January, and will be reviewed. Indeed, all things are under a constant level of review. And similarly, I think on one of the aspects in terms of school transport, we've been working with the EA on a range of measures, and indeed particularly part of the issue is the level of compliance that is there in terms of school transport with face coverings. So there will be spot checks, and EA will be working with us on that to try and push that up as much as possible. There is, to some extent, a level of constraint in school transport in terms of the numbers, but there will be a dramatic impact, particularly for the 4-week period, when effectively about a third of the school population will be taken out of the picture, will have an impact. I appreciate there's a range of other points that people have raised, and we'll try and get back to them. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, thank you. And as the amendment was tabled by the proposers of the motion, I call Ms Cara Hunter to conclude and wind up the debate on the motion and the amendment, and you have 10 minutes to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for being here today and for other members for their contributions here this morning. I welcome the opportunity to contribute today and to wind on this crucial debate. Before I move to other members' comments, I'd briefly like to say that I too have received mass correspondence from the public on their concern of the dire need for improved classroom safety measures. Also on the call for teachers and school staff to receive the vaccine sooner due to their constant, consistent hands-on engagement with multiple pupils every day. This is something we have raised weeks previous, and we would like to see teachers included as a priority. I recently spoke with a 25-year-old teacher who said, "I love my job, but I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared to go back to work." To meet the needs and the aspirations of our young people, Minister, tougher, clear safeguards are absolutely necessary and urgently required. The principle of creating a safe working environment for our teachers and a safe educational environment for our students is absolutely paramount. It demands action. As I only have 10 minutes here today to speak and a lot of comments to contribute, I will now move to comments from other members. I welcome the general and widespread recognition expressed from many of the members of the importance of safety in an educational setting during this crisis. Mr McCrossan stated his concern for the rising numbers of COVID-19 cases here in the north and how children can bring home the virus to their parents, their grandparents and many loved ones. He also noted Norma Foley has implemented additional measures in the south, such as mandatory masks. I share his concern regarding educational transport and private operators. I have spoken recently with a school bus driver in my constituency who lives in Limavady who recently got COVID during work on a school bus. He had 53 children on the bus from mixed households, and as a result of this, over 40 families had to self-isolate. I would be keen to hear more from the Minister on what is being done to protect children and drivers from his department. Mr Newton praised the Minister for steps taken so far and praised his statement this morning. He also thanked teachers and school staff and staff from the NHS for their devotion to helping the public. I too share his sentiment on that. However, he stated the Minister is aware of the seriousness of the situation, and I'll be quite frank that I struggle to agree with this, as on December 21st, in the Minister's statement to the Ad Hoc Committee on the subject of mass testing, he states he will begin to further explore. But I found this deeply concerning, as a well-planned mass testing plan is necessary for a safe and secure educational setting. Ms Brogan then went on and stated many questions remain unanswered, which is true, and emphasised her support and need for support for children who are vulnerable, have special needs, and for their families. Mr Butler from the UUP mentioned the very valid point of the importance of mental health during this time. He reiterated that mental health of ministers is also important, and I agree wholeheartedly. No minister is perfect. We are living in unprecedented and challenging times, and there is mass pressure on all of our ministers. However, I do feel today calling upon the Minister is both a key and fundamental step to seek clarity on what real, tangible steps will be taken to protect our constituents and their families. Mr Lyttle had mentioned his frustration at the lack of engagement he felt that the Minister had with the Education Committee and school leaders in a timely manner, making contingency plans somewhat difficult. I wholeheartedly agree. Minister, for schools to be a safe environment, organisation through effective communication with school leaders is vital. One teacher informed me, I get my updates through the news. I wish the department would engage with us more directly. That was a teacher from Claudy. Then Mr Bradley had stated, school is necessary for the development of pupils. I agree. School is fundamental to the well-being of young people. But to reiterate, as Mr McCrossan had stated earlier, this motion before us here today, none of us want to shut schools, but we simply recognise for them to reopen safely and securely, we must protect children, staff and their families. Moving on, Mr Colm Gildernew, who is also Chair of the Health Committee, rightly mentioned the valid point of the new COVID variant and the scientific evidence of increased transmission in young people and the difficulties that presents in school settings. He said he feels there have been times when the department has been slow to act. I echo this sentiment. Parents are genuinely afraid to send their kids to school in this time of uncertainty, and they seek leadership and enhanced communication from the department. Mr Humphrey echoed that cross-departmental collaboration is key in this pandemic. I agree. He also stated members can be too critical of ministers and they have tough decisions to make, which is true. But I think, and this is somewhat of an unfair statement, as MLAs it is a fundamental aspect of our role to scrutinise and hold ministers to account. Mrs Flynn,
Just following our last point, would the member agree with me? It's not like the Minister didn't have any sight that these problems would arise. He was warned that school should not return to his business as usual by the Health Minister several weeks ago.
I thank the Minister for his intervention. Yes, and this is a key issue that many people have echoed to me as well through my constituency office. It's key that we have long contingency plans to continually assess what will happen within the next couple of weeks and months. Back to Mr Humphrey's point, yeah, it is important that we hold our ministers to account. Ms Flynn started saying that clarity is urgent and necessary. She reiterated mental health is very important during this pandemic and stated children from deprived areas are suffering greatly with increased anxiety. I find this very worrying also. Minister, we've known since the start of this pandemic that anxiety in young people of school age is a huge issue, and I welcome your comments about the £5 million and that investment, and I would like to hear more about that as well. Mr McNulty reiterated earlier his fear for young children and the distress they may find when taking the transfer test, and I agree with this wholeheartedly. Mr Nesbitt voiced his concerns about the nature of this debate today. Was it simply an opportunity to lambast the Minister? He also sought further clarity on contingency plans and that we must all work together during this difficult time. I agree. Mr O'Dowd had voiced that he would like to see the Minister plan for if schools were to close for a significant period of time. And Mrs Armstrong reiterated the point of mental health being impacted by the lack of the decisions from the department. She also stated that we must apologise to teachers, and I absolutely agree with you on that, as well as many members in the House will also. Teachers and principals are fundamentally overwhelmed. The lack of answers, time to prepare, is causing undeniable anxieties. Mr McGrath had mentioned the transportation issues again. They are also a massive issue, and asked for clarity on children with special needs in mainstream schools. Mrs Wood stated 45% of young people didn't feel safe in their workplace, school or college, and called for a youth conference. I think that's a fantastic idea and to boost engagement also with the public. Mr Carroll lastly emphasised his frustration, stating he is worried about workers across schools and would like to have seen the Minister act sooner. Yes?
Does the member agree with me that it is entirely regrettable, given that we've had this recall petition today, we've heard the Minister, we've listened to him for 20 minutes and we're still no clear as to any detail about what mitigations, protections or resources he is specifically putting in place to protect kids, classroom assistants, teachers, school staff, bus drivers, and he still hasn't confirmed if he will publish the advice that he has received.
I thank the member for his intervention. I agree. I think it is regrettable. I think clarity is absolutely necessary, and above all things, it gives people that crucial time to plan ahead. But just to close, I would like to thank members here today for their contributions, and I hope I've been able to fit them all in. Lastly, Minister, just briefly, the numbers of coronavirus positive tests are really staggering and increasing greatly this week. As you've mentioned, I believe on the 30th there was 2,341 cases. So it's a really dangerous, serious time, which you have acknowledged. With school due to return shortly, teachers, simply by doing their job, undoubtedly increase their odds of being a victim of this virus. As I draw my remarks to a close, we ask you to note the concerns voiced here today in this chamber and your acknowledgement of the mass increases of COVID-19 cases and the challenges that they present. We ask that you listen to the needs of the public and their worries and hold health and safety with the utmost priority. I hope members support this motion.
Thank you. And the question is that the amendment standing in the names of Daniel McCrossan, Justin McNulty and Colm McGrath be made. All those in favour say aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that the motion as amended be agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Thank you very much. The question is that the motion standing on the order. Sorry, next wrong page. Item 3 on the order paper is the adjournment. The question is that the Assembly do now adjourn. The Assembly is adjourned, and Happy New Year to all the members and all of our staff. Thank you very much.